Sir, namaskar. Welcome, sir.
Yes, good to see you. Very good to see you.
Thank you, sir. We have our Honorable Vice Chancellor and Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences who just joined in the meeting. So I extend heartiest welcome to them.
We are very honored by their presence.
I am saying the namaskar to Professor Chakravarti and welcome to this webinar. So definitely we all are eager to listen to you.
Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti, who was a distinguished professor of philosophy and religion in Davis and Elkinson College, West Virginia, is at present the president of Institute for Cross-Cultural Studies and Academic Exchange. To inform our audience, Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti has authored several landmark books which are being used as textbook in different universities of abroad. For example, Classical Indian Philosophy of Mind, the Nyaya Dualist Tradition, then Definition and Induction, that is another very interesting book, and then Logic of Gautama, then Towards Dualism, and many more such works. Professor Chakravarti is one of the widely published philosophers from India, and if you wish, you can just refer to different works which are appeared in Philosophy East and West, one of the leading journals of philosophy, then Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, International Philosophical Quarterly, Journal of Indian Philosophy, and he himself is the editor of a journal named Journal of Indian Philosophy and Religion. With this brief introduction, I wish to inform the audience that this lecture is going to be the inaugural lecture of ICPR Study Circle meetings at SMBDU. ICPR Study Circle meetings are organized through different institutions by the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University, the School of Philosophy and Culture here is selected for this year, 21 and 22, to organize ICPR lecture. So this is the inaugural lecture. I am really grateful to Professor Kishore Chakravarti that he agreed to be part of this study circle and be the first professor to deliver a lecture. And study circle is going to have monthly lecture. So I wish that all of you who are connected today or who may be connecting afterwards, please keep yourself updated. I will be mailing you all regarding the other lectures. So here I welcome Professor Kishore Chakravarti for this inaugural lecture. The title of the lecture is Epistemic and Spiritual Empowerment of People through the Conceptual Resources of Indian Philosophy. And he will be drawing largely from the Nyaya philosophy, being a Nyaya scholar, and he has a very good access to all other traditions. We have learned from none other than Professor Kishore Chakravarti that if we read any system of Indian philosophy, we are going to be familiar with other systems because the dialogue or the exchange between different systems is so fine and so intimate that it is not possible to understand one system in exclusion to other systems. But of course, for the sake of managing scholarly and academic writing, one has to focus on something because of our limited capacity. So I welcome on this occasion Professor Kishore Kumar Chakravarti to guide us on this very theme. The idea behind this theme is that the common population must be familiar with the philosophical resources available in the tradition. And once they are familiar, so I argue with my students that the logical component which we draw from any source, unless we intend to do bad logic, we are going to naturally formulate good arguments. So with that objective, we call it a kind of epistemic empowerment by familiarizing the audience with the resources, logical resources available in the Indian tradition. And then if we are too much into logicality, then of course something must be missing. And therefore we wish to have a kind of transformation from logicality to what we call spirituality. So the discourses which are supposed to be conducted through the study circle meeting from our School of Philosophy and Culture at Srimasta Vaishno Devi University is supposed to not just logically or epistemically empower the people, but also lead them to think about spiritual transformation. So these talks are certainly going to be beneficial for the development of intellectual competence, as well as transforming the very personality and developing more of human elements in the consciousness. I have personal perspective on this, that when we grow, so it's not that we are growing human consciousness. In fact, it is consciousness which generates more humanity, and we may call that a growing human consciousness in our personality, but it's a kind of consciousness which is going to embrace more and more humanity or elements from humanity as such. So I invite Professor Kishore Chakravarti to enlighten our audience and guide us to conduct the further meetings also through his delivery today. So Professor Chakravarti, you are most welcome. Kindly take over.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, part of this August occasion, and I'm sure that the future meetings organized by you will also be very productive and fruitful. Of course, it's absolutely important that a philosophy program and a program of philosophy and culture engages in such activities. That is, especially in Indian philosophy, knowledge is always considered to be the necessary means for spiritual progress. And spiritual progress is inseparable from moral progress, from the viewpoint of all the schools, all the major schools of Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy is so vast, it is going to be very superficial if I try to cover too many different areas and schools of Indian philosophy. So instead of doing that, I'm going to focus on only one particular school of Indian philosophy and their viewpoint on epistemic empowerment and spiritual empowerment, and the bridge between the two, between epistemic empowerment and spiritual empowerment, is moral empowerment. So that is a Nyaya position, and so I'm going to speak on that. In other words, I'm going to speak on the Nyaya viewpoint of epistemic empowerment, moral empowerment, and spiritual empowerment. In the Nyaya viewpoint, they are indispensable. In order to have moral empowerment, you must have epistemic empowerment. And in order to have spiritual empowerment, you must have moral empowerment as well as epistemic empowerment. So from the earliest times, the Nyaya school has taken that position. And this position is not just unique to Indian philosophy, I would like to say. There are great Western philosophers. Probably, they were also influenced by Indian philosophy. There is much evidence of such contact and influence. Since time is short, I'm not going to get into that, but I will mention a couple of great Western philosophers who probably were influenced by Indian philosophy in the light of the very, very substantial evidence we have. And they are Plato and Aristotle, the great Greek philosophers. Clearly, in Plato's view, he has argued for this view in many dialogues, including the Meno, for example, one of his famous dialogues, that virtue is knowledge. So the road to moral and spiritual progress is through knowledge in Plato's view. He was a supporter of what we may call in the Indian philosophical context, Jnana Marga, which of course is a very highly developed viewpoint in many of the Upanishadic writings. And it is quite probable that those Upanishadic writings were known to, because of the high level of contact between the Greeks and the Persians and the Indians at that time, were known to the great Greek philosophers, the Jnana Marga approach. And so Plato took this position very clearly that a good life has to be a life of reason. A good life has to be a thoughtful life. And that is also Aristotle's view, who was a direct student of Plato, no surprise there. And for him, a moral choice has to be a rational choice. And so I don't wish to spend more time on these great Greek philosophers. I just want to say that the viewpoint that I'm going to talk about, based on the Nyaya perspective, is not unique by any means to Indian philosophy. Probably due to the influence of Indian philosophers on the Greek philosophers. The great Greek philosophers also support many of the ideas that I'm going to talk about now. So Nyaya Darshana, or Nyaya philosophy, is one of the 6 orthodox systems of Hindu philosophy. Though the main focus of the Nyaya is on logic and epistemology, and to a lesser extent on ontology, it also contains a theory of what we should do, or what for us is the right thing to do, and a theory of why we should do it, and what is good, based most importantly on study of the true nature of the self, Atma Tattva Jnana. This may be called Nyaya ethics and the Nyaya path of moral empowerment and spiritual empowerment. Our brief account of Nyaya epistemic, moral, and spiritual empowerment is directly based on the original Sanskrit sources and touches on both viewpoints, often treated cursorily in modern studies, that Nyaya shares in some ways with many other Indian philosophical schools, and those that are distinctive of Nyaya. We first turn to the Nyaya Sutra, the founding work of the Nyaya school, and the oldest available commentary called the Nyaya Bhashya. According to Nyaya Sutra 1.1.1, through awareness of 16 topics, like sources of knowing, the knowables, doubt, purpose, the steps of demonstration, the pseudo-probantia, and so on, leads to the highest good. Nyaya Sutra 1.1.9 gives a list of 12 knowables, namely the self, the body, the external sense organs, the objects, that is, objects of voluntary action, mainly pleasure, pain, artha, pleasure, pain, and their causal conditions, cognitive states, buddhi, the inner sense, manas, volition, prayatna, failings, dosha, rebirth, pritya bhava, fruits of voluntary actions, phala, suffering, dukkha, and liberation, apavarga. Nyaya Bhashya on that glosses that true awareness of the knowables, beginning with the self, leads to the highest good. and moral and spiritual empowerment. Thus, though knowledge of all 16 topics listed in the first sutra, first Nyaya Sutra, is useful for the highest good, knowledge of the knowables such as the self, the body, volition, failings, and so on are directly relevant for the highest good and moral and spiritual empowerment. Of the knowables again, the self is the most important. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Please carry on. Yes, sir.
Okay. Of the knowables again, the self is the most important, and it is knowledge of the self that is the most directly relevant for the highest good and moral and spiritual empowerment, though knowledge of all knowables and indirectly of all 16 topics is useful for that purpose. So many schools of Indian philosophy emphasize the role of knowledge for moral and spiritual progress. But the distinctive part of Nyaya is the epistemic, is the epistemic area, the way it has laid down the epistemic area. Just look at the topics. Pramana. For moral and spiritual progress, for moral and spiritual empowerment, we need to learn about the sources of knowing, the pramanas, the prameyas, sanshaya, doubt, prayojana, right? Drishtanta, siddhanta, avayava, the demonstrative steps, tarka, indirect style of reasoning, and so on and so on. Vitanda, chala, jati, nigrahasthana. All of these are very, very important for logical purposes, right? Vitanda, chala, jati, nigrahasthana, etvabhasa. What kind of mistakes are to be avoided when we are arguing for something? Now, why do the Nyaya philosophers take this position? What I want to say is that other schools of Indian philosophy also agree with Nyaya on the point that knowledge is necessary for moral and spiritual progress. The distinctive part of Nyaya is that they take the requirement of knowledge to a very high level and include such logical topics as fallacies. You have to be well-grounded in all the sources of knowing, perception, inference, authority, and so on. Learn how to avoid mistakes in arguing, and so on. This is distinctively the Nyaya viewpoint. Not that the other schools of Indian philosophy are ignorant of this or are opposed to this, but the Nyaya emphasizes on this to a great extent. Why do they do that? This is because of the basic viewpoint of Nyaya that the chief obstacle and impediment to moral and spiritual progress and empowerment of the people comes from false knowledge, mithya jnana. And false knowledge of many things, but especially false knowledge of what they regard as mukhya prameya, namely the Atman or the self. False knowledge of the self. What is typical false knowledge of the self? It is wrong identification of the self with what is not the self. So how do we do that in common parlance in our everyday life? It's very easy to see that. Very commonly, we say things like, I am fat, or, I am deaf, etc., etc. Now just pay attention to what I'm saying. When I'm saying I am fat, I'm attributing a property of the body to me, which implies that I am identifying myself with my body, which in the Nyaya perspective is wrong and is the main reason why we falter, we fall back in the path of moral and spiritual empowerment. The wrong identification of the self with the body leads to all kinds of failings, many, many failings that we have, such as greed for more possessions, such as anger, such as lust, sexual promiscuity. It is very easy to see that if we strongly separate the self from the body, we shall be reluctant to fall victim to such failings as greed, as lust, and so on. They are clearly grounded in the body. So this wrong identification of the self with the body in the Nyaya view is a serious obstacle. It makes us selfish, it makes us egoistic, and prevents us from leading a moral and spiritual life. But knowledge of the self is not easy to achieve in the Nyaya view. For these early Nyaya philosophers, the self is not perceived. It can only be inferred from certain signs, such as pleasure, pain, and so on. The Nyaya Sutra 1.1.9 lays down some signs, inferential marks, with the help of which the self can be inferred, such as pleasure, pain, and so on. And that is why, since our knowledge of the self in the view of the early Nyaya philosophers has to be grounded not on perception, but on inference, and knowledge of the self is absolutely necessary for moral and spiritual empowerment, that is why there is so much focus in Nyaya philosophy on topics like, avayava, the demonstrative steps, tarka, indirect reasoning, hetvabhasa, fallacies, because otherwise we are likely to go astray. We are likely to make too many mistakes and fall behind instead of making progress. So that is the distinctive viewpoint of Nyaya when it comes to epistemic empowerment. Their emphasis on, a lot of emphasis on the sources of knowing, including especially anumana or inference, because that is indispensable for knowledge of the self. That is the main point. Inference is indispensable for knowledge of the self, and without that we cannot make moral and spiritual progress. So the highest good is liberation, apavarga. And what is that? According to Nyaya Sutra 1.1.22, liberation is the absolute relief from that. So what is that? Since the immediately previous aphorism is devoted to suffering, Nyaya Bhashya takes that to stand for suffering. So liberation in the Nyaya view is absolute relief from suffering. And this is the highest good and the highest stage of moral and spiritual empowerment. There is absolute relief from suffering. Similar ideas are voiced in what is often regarded as the sister philosophical school called the Veisheka. The Veisheka Sutra, the founding work of that school of philosophy, begins by proclaiming that dharma will be explained. Veisheka Sutra 1.1.1. The word dharma, that means what holds or supports, literally, is sometimes used in a very general sense, like the English word thing. It is also often used to mean righteousness. Since the Veisheka Sutra proceeds to develop an ontology of all that exists and also gives an account of righteousness, both senses of dharma are intended in the above aphorism. In particular, the next aphorism, Veisheka Sutra 1.1.2, says that dharma is that through which there is progress and accomplishment of the highest good. The commentary called Upaskara of the 16th century of the Common Era explains that awareness of the truth is progress, absolute cessation of suffering is the highest good, and the dharma is that through which both come. Progress or awareness of truth is the gateway to the highest good. The Pradar Dharma Sangraha, the second most influential work of the Vaisheshika school, says that true awareness of similarities and differences of the 6 categories of substance, quality particular, motion, universal, ultimate differentiator, and inherence is the causal condition of the highest good. Again, the emphasis on knowledge. This early Vaisheshika work mentions God in many places. and emphasizes the importance of generally binding samanya dharmas, obligations, like non-violence, caregiving, truthfulness, and other observances and restraints, yamas and niyamas, as well as true awareness for achieving the absolute end of suffering as the highest good and level of moral and spiritual empowerment. Thus, both the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika, both of which are theistic, agree that the absolute end of suffering is the highest good and the highest level of moral and spiritual empowerment, and that knowledge is the means to that. Epistemic empowerment is the means to that. This viewpoint is also supported by the Sankhya, another orthodox Hindu school, though the latter is atheistic and offers a different kind of ontology and understanding of knowledge. And I'm skipping that because of limited time. That knowledge is the means to the highest good is also the view of the Advaita Vedanta and others. Though again in Advaita Vedanta, the highest good is conceived not only negatively as the end of all suffering, but also positively as a state of eternal bliss. The connection between knowledge and virtue is also central in Buddhism and Jainism. And I've already mentioned the connection that we find in the writings of great Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle on that subject. That liberation is the highest good is part of the widely held view in traditional Hinduism that there are four basic goods or values or purposes, purushartha, namely in the ascending order, wealth, pleasure, righteousness, and liberation. These are basic values in the sense that all our voluntary actions are taken to be aimed directly or indirectly at some of these values, and other values like employment or marriage are means to some of these values. Among the four basic values, liberation, moksha, is the highest value for the following reason. It is nature to seek relief from suffering. The other three values do bring relief from suffering. Thus, wealth can bring relief from suffering due to, say, starvation, lack of shelter, etc. Similarly, pleasure provides relief from suffering and does take place in intervals of suffering, as the Nyaya Sutra 4.1.55 explicitly says. Though suffering is pervasive, pleasure in intervals of suffering is directly experienced by us and cannot be denied. This is important, for it would be a mistake to think that pleasure reduces to relief from suffering. That is how the Nyaya view has been presented in many histories of Indian philosophy that we have in English. So to counter that, I am pointing out from the best sources, that is the Nyaya Sutra itself is directly saying pleasure is not to be reduced to relief from suffering. It is true that suffering and not pleasure is explicitly mentioned in the list of 12 knowable. This is the basis of why so many modern authors on Nyaya philosophy think that pleasure is to be reduced to relief from suffering. The main ground is that pleasure is not explicitly mentioned in the list of the 12 knowables that I have already cited earlier. Suffering is mentioned, but not pleasure. Okay. That was a valuable input. Anyway, let me continue. But this does not take anything away from the irreducibility of pleasure. It is natural to mention suffering and not pleasure explicitly in the enunciation of the knowables. For liberation that is listed immediately after suffering is viewed as absolute end of suffering and not as a state of pleasure. Nevertheless, Nyaya Sutra 1.1.10 mentions both pleasure and suffering explicitly as inferential marks, among others, of the self. were pleasure to be viewed as nothing more than relief from suffering, as some accounts of Indian philosophy claim, from the Nyaya perspective, that is, it would not make sense to claim that pleasure is a distinct inferential mark separate from suffering. Further, Nyaya Bhashya on 1.1.10 explains that pleasure is an inferential mark of the self in the following sense. When one finds pleasure from something, one may seek to acquire that thing after encountering it. This shows that one recognizes something as the same as what has been experienced before, and such recognition is a ground for inferring that the self is permanent. What matters for us is that pleasure is here accepted not only as real and different from relief from suffering, because it is offered as a different mark, a different inferential mark, but also as a good, also as a value. One recognizes something as being a source of pleasure in the past and seeks to have that thing again as the means to pleasure. Again, the Nyaya Sutra 4.1.51 says, pleasure belongs to the self, there can be no denial of pleasure, and implies that pleasure cannot be as a fruit or end, follower of effort. The Nyaya Sutra 4.1.52 acknowledges that children, possessions, etc. too are commonly spoken of as fruits or ends. But it clarifies that these other things are fruits or ends in an extended sense, upacharita artha, because of being related to pleasure. Thus, pleasure is also as a basic end, so that some other things that are means to pleasure may also be called ends in a derivative sense. It goes without saying that pleasure never lasts long enough and is inseparable from and is replaced by suffering, and accordingly is not accepted as good. Next, there is righteousness. In the Nyaya view, righteous action produces merit and virtue, dharma, as distinguished from unrighteous action that produces demerit and vice, adharma. Such and merit and vice are quality particulars or guna located in the self and serve as causal conditions of pleasure and pain, respectively. But pleasures from the merits of good acts are not everlasting and are succeeded by suffering from the demerits of bad acts. Thus, the relief is not only temporary, but further, the causal conditions of pleasure, such as the body, the sense organs, etc., are also invariably causal conditions of suffering, and under ordinary circumstances do give rise to suffering. Accordingly, liberation that involves absolute relief from suffering, and in traditional Hinduism, it is claimed to be achievable. Absolute relief from all suffering is achievable, is superior to the others that can only provide temporary relief, not absolute relief. True awareness sets us free. False awareness traps us into bondage and suffering. And I mentioned statements like dark, as the self is a main cause of egotism, cause awareness given in the Nyaya Bhashya on 1.1.2. Eternal for the eternal, mistaking what does not save for what saves, mistaking what is to be feared for what is not to be feared, and so on and so on. False awareness leads to attachment to those that appear to be inimical. Such attachment and leads to feelings such as jealousy, deception, and greed. Harping on the faults of others, speaking incoherently. There are also internal bad dispositions, such as enmity towards others, coveting others' wealth, and faithlessness. Some with bad acts and dispositions. There are also external and good dispositions. There are external good deeds by the body, such as giving, saving someone, and serving others. There are external good deeds by speech, such as speaking the truth, speaking what is beneficial, speaking what is pleasant, and speaking about the self or self-study, swadhyaya. There are also internal good dispositions, such as compassion, ungreediness, and faith. I'm mentioning those particularly because in modern accounts of Nyaya philosophy, these are overlooked. So the Nyaya Bhashya 1.1.18 goes on to say that besides attachment and detestation, raga and dvesha, and all failings are included in these three, lead to activities that are causal conditions of pleasure, as kinds of failings more harmful than the other two. Nyaya Sutra 4.1.6 answers the question in the affirmative and identifies confusion or false awareness as the most harmful kind of failing. Nyaya Bhashya 4.1.6 clarifies that attachment and detestation, that are the two other kinds of failing, do not arise unless there is confusion and false awareness. Hence, the latter, that is confusion and false awareness, is more harmful than the other two. In other words, confusion is the root of the other failings and is the most harmful. Can one overcome the failings? Give way. 46. The right step is that purification of the self, Atma Sangaskara, with the help of yama and niyama, restraint and observance. What is restraint and observance? According to Nyaya Bhashya 4.2.46, restraint is what is common to the four stages of life and is meritorious, while observance is what is specific to a particular stage of life and is meritorious, such as, for example, non-possession, aparigraha, and continence do not in the strict sense apply to the householder stage, garhasthya, and thus on the face of it do not fall under restraint in this Nyaya understanding. However, both non-possession and continence are included under restraint in the highly influential and widely known account of restraint and observance in the Yoga Sutra. I'm happy that Madhu is now studying that. There, the restraints are non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, and non-possession, while the observances are cleanliness, contentment, penance, self-study, and devotion, surrendering one's actions to God. The fact that the Nyaya Bhashya does not refer to this famous yoga view is probably due to the Nyaya Bhashya being an earlier work. In the super commentary of Vachaspati Misra, which itself is a commentary on the Nyaya Vartika Udyodhakara, which itself is a commentary on the Nyaya Bhashya, which itself is a commentary on the Nyaya Sutra, the yoga view of restraint observance is presented. In a sense, however, the Nyaya Bhashya view of restraint is not incompatible with the yoga view. It is a common obligation in all stages of life. It is a samanya dharma, that is, to avoid violence, falsehood, stealing, sexual promiscuity, and an overzealous pursuit of material possession. Thus, the common saying that the sky is the limit, it is a dangerous prescription from this Nyaya viewpoint. Each one of these 5 kinds of activities to be avoided causes demerit. And due to accrual of demerit, one engaging in any of these falls in the road of liberation. That is, violence, falsehood, etc., instead of alleviating suffering, adds to suffering in the Nyaya point of view. Since the Nyaya Bhashya speaks of restraint as what produces merit, by implication, it excludes activities that place further roadblocks to the goal of liberation and moral and spiritual empowerment. According to a very ancient view, restraint is not doing what is forbidden. In the super commentary called the Parishuddhi of Udayana of the 11th century, the great Nyaya philosopher endorses this ancient view of restraint. Since not doing what is forbidden is a common obligation in all 4 stages of life and is meritorious, by way of not adding more demerits to the burden of karma, the Nyaya Bhashya account of restraint is consistent with this very ancient view. The moot point is that there is no real conflict between the Nyaya position and the Yoga position when it comes to restraint and observance, and that building a virtuous or good character through restraint, observances, and control of failings is essential for moral and spiritual progress. We have seen that what is right in this viewpoint is true awareness that removes false awareness, that is a causal condition of attachment, detestation, and confusion, and purification of the self through restraint and observance that help to eradicate failings through various acts of omission and commission, reduce the burden of demerit, and increase the stock of merit. We have also seen that liberation as the end of all suffering is the highest good and value and the highest stage of moral and spiritual empowerment. Thus, this viewpoint includes a theory of the right and the theory of the good as a key ingredients of the path of moral and spiritual empowerment. What is right is viewed and justified as being instrumental to achieving the goal of liberation as the highest good. In other words, the case for true awareness as what is right in this viewpoint is based on being viewed as the means to liberation as the ultimate end. And so is also the case for purification of the self that involves eradication of failings. Not only are these justified as the means to the accepted end, but further, these different acts of omission and commission are accorded high moral status and high spiritual status because of being the means to the same end. Since in this viewpoint, what is right is justified as the means to the end, and different acts are given similar or the same depending on how directly or indirectly these are related to the end, moral and spiritual values, because of being the means to the same end, this viewpoint is consequentialist. This is my assessment of the Nyaya perspective, that it is a consequentialist perspective. The main thrust of this viewpoint is on individual progress, individual moral and spiritual progress. Still, consideration for others is essential in the Nyaya perspective for individual moral and spiritual progress. This is clear, and I emphasize this because in most modern accounts, this aspect of Nyaya philosophy is ignored or misrepresented. This is clear from the moral precepts mentioned above. Thus, the bad acts and dispositions that are causal conditions of demerit include violence, stealing, sexual transgression, false speech, harsh speech, harping on others' faults, speaking incoherently, enmity towards others, coveting others' possessions, and so on. These are not only detrimental to oneself, but are also harmful to others. While one has an obligation not to indulge in bad acts and dispositions, these also imply that others have rights to life, property, and so on, as Vachaspati Misra has explicitly argued in Tatparya Tika. That is, the point of these admonitions is that one has an obligation to safeguard the rights of others. And a violation of these rights comes at a very high moral and spiritual cost, as Vachaspati Misra in Tatparya Tika explicitly says. Such rights are implied in much of Indian moral thought and spiritual thought, not only in Hindu thought, but in Buddhist and Jain thought as well. And so it is no surprise that this is the case with the Nyaya as well. And we can further build on this by pointing to the good acts and dispositions that are causal conditions of merit and include giving, saving someone, serving someone, true speech, beneficial speech, pleasant speech, kindness, that are not only beneficial to oneself, but are also for the benefit of others. Again, failings include infatuation for the other sex, kama, unwillingness to share with others what is not depleted by use, matsara, greed for others' possessions, and deception, that all have adverse consequences for oneself as well as others. Mention is also made of compassion, karunya, karuna, understood as willingness to relieve the suffering of others without regard to one's own interest. Let me repeat. Karuna is willingness to relieve the suffering of others without regard to one's own interest. In this viewpoint, that is the Nyaya viewpoint, the body, the sense organs, indeed, anything and everything in the mundane world may sometimes be causal conditions of pleasure. Nevertheless, they are all invariably also causal conditions of pain. Hence, not only pain, but also the body and so on are considered to be suffering in the extended sense, for they are inseparable from suffering. Thus, liberation as the end of all suffering requires ultimately nothing short of putting a complete stop to the beginningless anadi process of birth and death. But this ethics, the Nyaya path of moral and spiritual empowerment, it must be kept in mind, is a path of engagement. The engagement is for relieving suffering not only for oneself, but also for others. And one cannot reach the ultimate goal without engaging in the service of others. If altruism means that everyone should give up one's interest for others, the Nyaya perspective is not altruistic. However, if altruism involves that serving others is beneficial for everyone, including one's own self, that in some situations one should sacrifice one's possessions, even life, for others. And in a sense, this benefits oneself from the viewpoint of karma. And that sometimes working as a group helps everyone, including oneself, more than working individually alone. For example, this is emphasized in the Nyaya Sutra and the Nyaya Bhashya 4.2.47, 48, and so on, 52 and 53. They speak of the value of fellowship. So keeping all those in mind, we have to say that this viewpoint has an altruistic dimension as well. We have noted that liberation as a highest good is conceived minimally in the Nyaya view as the absolute end of suffering and not as a state of bliss, ananda, or happiness or pleasure, even in a sublime sense. Though pleasure is often taken to be the highest good, as the Nyaya Bhashya explicitly points out. So it is often viewed as the highest good, but in the Nyaya view, it is not the highest good. This is because pleasure, even in the most sublime sense, in the Nyaya perspective, is invariably inseparable from suffering. Pleasure and suffering are inseparable, number one, in the sense that wherever there is pleasure, there is suffering. And wherever there is suffering, there is pleasure. The vyapti is there. They are also inseparable too, in the sense that they both arise from the same causal conditions. Whatever is a causal condition of pleasure is also a causal condition of suffering, and vice versa. So, Udayana, Veisheka, and others really go into this in great depth. This holds even though merit is a causal condition of pleasure and demerit is a causal condition of suffering. They are further inseparable, three, in the sense that both are co-located. Both pleasure and suffering are invariably co-located in the same person. They are again inseparable, four, in the sense that both are experienced together. Whoever experiences pleasure also experiences suffering, and vice versa, either successively or even simultaneously. So the claim is not that whenever you experience pleasure, you must always experience pain. No. The claim is either simultaneously or successively. And on this, though the Nyaya subscribes to non-simultaneity, they make an exception here. So simultaneous experience of pleasure and pain is possible in the Nyaya perspective. And this is how it is presented by Udyotakara in the Nyaya Vartika. So this is Udyotakara's view on 1.1.2. The Nyaya Bhashya goes on to claim that pleasure breeds hankering, pariyeshana, that can never be fulfilled. Sometimes pleasures come, but are short-lived. Sometimes pleasures do happen, but fall short of the mark. Sometimes pleasures come at a very high price of burdensome suffering. Further, and more importantly, pleasures typically lead to the need for more pleasure and often for other pleasures. All these eventually turn into an insatiable thirst, trishna. Nyaya Bhashya cites an old saying, even when one who seeks pleasure finds it, one is quickly entrapped for another pleasure. The Nyaya Bhashya cites another old saying, even if one succeeds in acquiring the whole earth, all the way to the ocean, with all cows and horses, one is still not satisfied and thirsts for more. How can there be pleasure or happiness or satisfaction from desire for possession? The point is well taken. If it is the very nature of pleasure to drive us for more, pleasure inevitably leads to unfulfillment and dissatisfaction and suffering. The paradox of pleasure stares us with ominous certainty. The irony is that we often find pleasure when we do not pursue pleasure, but pursue other things such as fishing, philanthropy, and so on. But if we pursue pleasure itself, we end up often empty-handed. Even if we find pleasure, there is always thirst for more that brings dissatisfaction and suffering. Since pleasure is inseparable from suffering, pleasure must be discarded, just as milk mixed with poison must be discarded, to put an absolute end to all suffering. Those who think that liberation as the highest good is not only devoid of suffering, but also a state of pleasure, bliss, from the Nyaya point of view, suffer from a dangerous clinging for pleasure and a serious delusion. Pleasure or happiness can only come with suffering and therefore is not the highest good. This is not to deny that pleasure is a fact of life and can be achieved. Our philosophers readily admit that pleasure is common experience, is real, and the body, etc., do serve as the causal conditions of pleasure. Nevertheless, the claim is that the causal conditions of pleasure are also invariably the causal conditions of suffering. We naturally abhor suffering, and nothing that involves suffering can be accepted as the ultimate good or goal. Thus, a state without suffering is higher than a state that includes pleasure and also suffering. The Nyaya philosophers are not here making a transition from X is desired to X is desirable, and something is not desired to something is undesirable, as Mill did, John Stuart Mill did. The Nyaya philosophers repeatedly point out that pleasure, etc., are commonly desired, but deny that they are desirable. Similarly, various things enjoined in moral and spiritual path may not be desired by many, may even appear to be horrible, but that does not make them, from the Nyaya point of view, undesirable. Still, there is a gap between what is desired and what should be desired, as also between what is not desired and what should not be desired. And one does not follow from the other. That's a mistake that John Stuart Mill made. Suffering is undesirable, not because it is desired, not because it is not desired. If this were so, pleasure would have been desirable because it is desired, as Mill claimed. For the Nyaya philosophers, both suffering and pleasure are undesirable. Though, of course, pleasure is desired, still it is undesirable. Thus, being actually desired or not being desired is not the proper basis for being desirable or undesirable for the Nyaya philosophers. Rather, the proper basis for both pleasure and suffering being undesirable is that both are harmful, ahita, and our failings, namely attachment, detestation, and confusion, are causal conditions of both. Thus, being rooted in our failings, that is the main point. Being rooted in our failings, neither suffering nor pleasure can be desirable as the highest stage of moral and spiritual progress. So the doctrine that it is a state of bliss or ananda must be discarded. The above Nyaya viewpoint is somewhat similar to negative utilitarianism, a viewpoint that is attributed to Karl Popper in such works as The Open Society and its Enemies. That the moral standard is minimizing suffering and not maximizing pleasure. That seems to be the Nyaya position. That is Karl Popper's position. But that also, according to Ninian, Smart, and others, appears to be the Nyaya position, negative utilitarianism. And that there is no symmetry between suffering and pleasure. Undoubtedly, the Nyaya does hold that the highest good is absolute end of suffering and rejects that this is a state of pleasure or ananda or bliss. However, for Nyaya, pleasure is real and a good, and even a basic good, as I've argued, though not the highest good, as I've argued as well. To a limited extent, the Nyaya viewpoint of being beneficial without causing more harm than good, that if we have time, we shall talk about later, can accommodate pleasure. So that is the basic moral and spiritual standard in the Nyaya perspective. If I have time, I shall get into that. But that can accommodate pleasure as a good. In other words, the Nyaya viewpoint does exclude pleasure in the ultimate analysis, but does not exclude pleasure in ordinary situations. Although all pleasures are inseparable from suffering and fall short of the highest end, one in the householder stage, as a grihastha, for example, is not disallowed in the Nyaya works from enjoying good things in life, such as food, children, etc. Accordingly, an objection against negative utilitarianism that Ninian Smart has actually leveled against the Nyaya as well because of this misunderstanding, that a benevolent world exploder if capable of achieving it with minimal pain, is duty bound to destroy all human life, to eliminate all suffering. This has no force. This objection has force against the Popperian position, but has no force against the Nyaya position, which should not be confused with the negative utilitarianism of Popper, as Ninian Smart and others do. So this objection does not apply to the Nyaya position because pleasure in this view is real. It does not reduce to relief from suffering. I have emphasized on that point earlier, you may remember. Further, generally binding obligations, the samanya dharmas, such as non-violence, ahimsa. How can you get rid of all human beings, kill all human beings, to get rid of all suffering without resorting to violence? Caregiving, this is a generally binding obligation. You have to care for others. You are disallowed from killing all people. You have to take care of them. And other restraints and observances preclude the hypothesis of such a benevolent world exploder. Now, as I mentioned, some hold that liberation as a high state is also a state of eternal pleasure or happiness. From that viewpoint, this should be distinguished from ordinary pleasures that come and go and are subject to causal conditions that also produce suffering. But from the Advaita viewpoint, this does not apply to Ananda that is not subject to causal conditions. In the Nyaya view, the individual self appears to be limited to the confines of the body, but in its true nature is ubiquitous, vibhu. Ubiquitousness of the self is not originated in liberation, but is revealed. Similarly, Ananda is not originated in moksha, but is just revealed. The Nyaya Bhashya offers a bunch of objections to this Vedanta viewpoint. Such manifestation or revelation must involve awareness, the Nyaya Bhashya points out. Nothing can be revealed without awareness, without cognition. Lack of awareness will make liberation indistinguishable from the state of bondage. But what is the causal condition of such awareness? Suppose it is said that such awareness too is nitya, like Ananda, so that no causal condition is called for. But then again, there is the same difficulty that bondage becomes indistinguishable from liberation. What if we suppose that though happiness, Ananda, is nitya, its awareness is anitya, non-eternal? Then we have the same old question about what is the causal condition of that awareness. If it is anitya, what if it is said that the contact between the self and the inner sense that is accepted by Nyaya as a common causal condition of cognitive states is that causal condition, Atma-Manas Samyoga. But then at least another causal condition that is not always available is needed. The problem is that the contact between the Atman and the Manas would have to be available always. And then such awareness should take place always. And then we have the familiar problem of bondage being indistinguishable from liberation. So Atma-Manas Samyoga cannot fill the role because it is always present. What if merit from yogic meditation, meditative practice, is that additional causal condition? But then the difficulty is that such merit is not everlasting. No merit is everlasting. When the merit is gone, awareness of Ananda will be gone as well. And then we have the same old issue of bondage being indistinguishable from liberation. Finally, pursuit of pleasure in all cases accepted by both sides. Now, this is important. We have two different viewpoints, the Nyaya viewpoint and the Vedanta viewpoint. But all cases acceptable to both sides in the debate, pursuit of pleasure is invariably bound up with attachment and suffering. Where is the rational basis acceptable to both sides to claim that pursuit of ananda is not bound with attachment and suffering? If there is no such basis, and if attachment and suffering are present, liberation would be impossible. And let me just move to something that will throw more light on this Nyaya perspective of epistemic, moral, and spiritual empowerment by making some comparisons with Western moral viewpoints. What I shall try to show in a few minutes is that certain difficulties in well-known Western moral philosophies can be effectively addressed from this Nyaya perspective that I have explained, not fully, of course, only partially so far. But if you allow me to finish this part of the presentation.
Please, sir, please.
So even, scholars like Bimal Motilal, who wrote so many wonderful books on Nyaya, have made this claim, and he's not the only one, others, that there is no Indian ethics. Indian philosophers have never presented an ethical theory in the proper sense. This is why I want to get into this also. This is such a such a confused view about Nyaya and other schools of Indian philosophy, that they have produced no ethics. And Motilal calls this a big lacuna, a big gap. Just imagine, Indian philosophy is so big. To claim that there is a lacuna, you have to study the whole of it. Is that humanly possible? Even to study Nyaya is not humanly possible. The literature is so big, not to speak of Indian philosophy. So I will mention three main Western moral philosophers. First, Kant, the viewpoint of the categorical imperative, that moral imperatives are absolute and unconditional, without any exception. Duty for the sake of duty. But what about situations where following a moral imperative such as telling the truth will produce serious harm? Just think of this case, which I am adapting from Kant himself. Suppose that a Nazi officer in Nazi Germany is knocking at your door and asking about the whereabouts of a Jewish family that you have allowed to hide in your basement. In Kant's view, you are always supposed to tell the truth. So when the Nazi officer asks you about this Jewish family, you should say, yes, I have allowed them to hide in the basement of my house. What will happen? If I say that, I will lose my head. And also all the entire Jewish family with all the children, they will also be killed. Loss of innocent lives can never be morally justified. So we must have a moral standard different from the Kantian standard that does not allow the possibility of any exceptions in any situation. We must be a moral standard that makes room for that, where the consequences are so horrible. Now, what is the Nyaya standard for moral and spiritual empowerment? Kriti sadhyatve sati, it should be achievable. Is the Kantian standard achievable? I dare say no. It is humanly impossible to stick to the standard of telling the truth always in all situations forever. It is not even achievable. So from the Nyaya perspective, the Kantian standard is to be rejected. It is not Kriti sadhya. But that is not the entire Nyaya standard of moral and spiritual empowerment. Kriti sadhyatve sati balavad anishta ajanaka ishta janakatva. So it should not cause more harm than good, roughly speaking. I'm skipping a proper discussion of it, but I think you are getting some sense of it. You are getting some sense of it. Again, in that example that I brought up, since telling the truth will cause more harm than good. My family will be destroyed. The Jewish family will be destroyed. I have, allowed them to stay. I've given them some kind of, a promise that I'm protecting them. So I'm violating that promise. So I'm violating all these moral prescriptions. So the Kantian perspective I'm claiming, is insufficient. But that problem does not arise in the Nyaya standard that I've explained to you, because the standard is different. It is one of being achievable and not causing more harm than good. So you will tell the falsehood in that case, because that will avoid that causing more harm than good. That is the right thing to do. I will move very quickly to another very famous Western moral standard, which is utilitarianism. Greatest happiness of the greatest number. That was developed by Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and in contemporary moral philosophy, utilitarianism is very, very highly popular. So utilitarianism is not recommending egoistic pleasure, because no one's pleasure is more important than somebody else's pleasure. But we should choose our actions for moral and spiritual progress based on what is going to cause more good to more people and less harm to more people. That is what we should choose to do. Very briefly, I'm skipping, since the time is short, the details of the utilitarian perspective. But I hope you can see that from the utilitarian perspective, it is very difficult to provide proper safeguards for the minorities, for minority rights. So I'm thinking of a case, possible case, that suppose we take away all the rights of a small number of people in our nation and make them work very hard, endlessly, all the time, exploit them to the full. And that helps the whole nation to actually be prosperous and more competitive and more successful against other nations. Now, this measure of taking away all the rights and torturing a small number of people in order to ensure the prosperity of a great number of people will pass the moral standard of utilitarianism. Utilitarians cannot avoid that. And that, in my view, is a very serious difficulty, because nobody's rights can be taken away summarily and arbitrarily like that for the sake of bringing the prosperity of so many others. Every person is morally important. As Kant said, on that point, the Nyaya position is absolutely uncompromising, like Kant's position. So from the Nyaya perspective, you cannot do that. First of all, I pointed out purification of the self is necessary from the Nyaya perspective. How can you have a purified self? You have to be egotistic to practice such a thing by causing so much torture and pain to some people, by labeling them out, separating them from the rest of the society and taking advantage of them. That can only be based on egotism. That has to be discarded for the Nyaya. Again, ahimsa. Again, karuna. All these are to be violated if we are to practice that. So from the Nyaya perspective, this can never be allowed. And also the standard of not causing more harm than good. If we practice that, then as Plato has argued in the Republic, there will never be proper peace in any society. If we take away the rights of some people, there will always be division and tension within the society, and that society can never achieve proper progress. Even Plato argued that, and Nyaya philosophers have argued that if you arbitrarily take away the rights of some people, there will never be loka sangraha, as that, Tatparya Tika, Udayana in Parishuddhi, they make this point. Loka sangraha will not be achieved. Common good will not be achieved. So the Nyaya perspective can address some of these difficulties of utilitarianism. It can also address, maybe I should stop, it is getting late. Aristotle's virtue theory also has many difficulties that I can try to show that will not arise in the Nyaya perspective. As you know from the Nyaya, as I've explained, building a strong character, a virtuous character, is absolutely necessary. I've already made that clear. So there is no incompatibility with Aristotle's virtue ethics on that point. But Aristotle's virtue ethics has many difficulties that the Nyaya position will not have. Maybe I should stop at this point. Leave that as a promise. I didn't fulfill right now, but it can be done. Okay. All right. Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful session again. I would request Honorable Vice Chancellor to say a few words and then open to others.
Yes, definitely it was a wonderful session, and for a person like me, it was very, very informative. At the same time, I was always trying to connect with so many words, and here in this session for the Nyaya perspective. So I could learn many things and I could experience. I was just thinking that I'm experiencing many things, what Professor Chakravarti was presenting and educating us. So such kind of lecture, I think it's very, very beneficial to even students and people who are not much aware with the different terminologies in the philosophy or in the Nyaya perspective, what he was telling, but he was explaining so simple language. And personally, I think I got benefited for many things through his lecture. And such kind of lecture I will request that should be organized very often by Anil Tiwari or under the ICPR study circle. Thank you very much. And I extend my heartiest thanks to Professor Chakravarti for such kind of wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
We are obliged. We are grateful to you for being with us for long hours with us. So this is really very, very inspiring. May I now request Professor Bhatt to say a few words for Professor Chakravarti.
So it was an enlightening lecture as a layman, but everybody should know these things with respect to his waves about identification of self, purification of self, and then knowledge, spirituality, and other related components. So I thank Professor Chakravarti for his very, very enlightening lecture. And this lecture should be actually in future So for such lectures, it should be for all staff and students. This is the need of our to listen to such lectures so that we gain something from out of it. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, Professor Chakravarti.
Very welcome, sir.
Thank you, sir, for very kind words. Now it is open to all. Anyone who has some curiosity, some reflection. And as Professor Bhatt rightly said, that the key is to understand who we are actually, the true nature of the self. And the problems with any sphere of our life is associated with lack of understanding. And that is key. One can take away from the whole idea of getting liberation completely from all dukkha. So it's open to the audience. If you have some query. Yes, Sagun Gupta, she is our BTech students.
Hello, hi.
Sagun Gupta.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Well, I would like to actually give everybody a compliment. You guys are so eloquent. Well, I understand that you are knowledgeable, but the way you prepared speech was so nice. And I really want to know what is the procedure of you, of like the preparation, like how did you prepare for these long speeches? Like this is a secondary question. My main question is that, like I'm a BTech student, and while I'm really interested in philosophy, it is impossible for me to learn everything that is there in philosophy. Even if like I'm just talking about the theoretical things like you discussed about today, spirituality, knowing oneself, but that's the theoretical aspect. How can a person like me incorporate principles of philosophy in their practical lives? Like I'll give you an example. Which is a problem I often encounter. When it comes to giving, okay? Giving, one situation is when somebody is begging you, okay, on the streets. This is something we come across very often, that people coming to you, children coming to you asking for money. So what do you do at such a situation? While giving is something that you should always be up to for, right? I should give. But then at a situation, you think about so many things going around you, what people tell you. And secondly, when it comes to, sometimes your friends ask you for help, that is not probably morally correct. Okay, but then your responsibility is to be a good friend too, and still not do something ethically wrong. And how do you differentiate between them? Matlab, how do you incorporate philosophy into your real life and make it actually something important for everybody to understand? Because it is a very important part of our lives, understanding about ourselves and understanding about the life. And apparently that's every person needs to know, not just a BTech student or a philosopher.
Fair enough.
Thanks.
So Professor Chakravarti, you would like to respond her. It's a very nice question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sagun.
Thank you, Shagun, for the wonderful question. Indian philosophy has never been knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Aristotle eulogized knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And we have darshanas, Nyaya Darshana, Sankhya Darshana. This is never knowledge only for the sake of knowledge. This is always for making a difference in our lives, how we can live better, and how we can help others to live better. All Indian philosophies have this practical dimension. All Indian philosophies. They can be immersed in logical studies and epistemologies and so on. And it is very highly developed, technical. All of that is true. But it always has a practical dimension. How it can make our lives and the lives of others better. So that is what we have to keep in our mind when we address it in any particular situation in life, such as some of the ones you mentioned. True, we should share what we have with others who are in need. And it is a failing if we fail to share what we have, if by sharing it, we are not going to be left with what is too little. This failing is called matsara. when we can share with others what we have, and by sharing, it will not get so depleted that when it comes to our own case of need, when we have to find that for, say, our own child or our own parent and so on, we should not share by depleting what we have to that level. As I pointed out, this is known as matsara. But if it is not depleted to the level that leaves us with too little to take care of others whom we should take care, such as our parents, such as our children, then we should share. So you asked me about, what to do in a situation like that. Yes, we should give. Well, that is the standard of giving. It should be achievable. Remember, you see, giving everything away is not achievable. It also violates one's obligations. You see, everybody lives within a social network with variety of obligations. So we have to keep our obligations always in mind. So sharing is to be guided by that. But if we can take care of those to whom we are obligated and have enough to share, we must share. If we don't, that is moral and spiritual degradation. So that is the guiding principle. Yes, we must share. We must share with others. As long as we do not have what we have is not left too depleted for us to be able to take care of our obligations. Does that help you in any way at all, Sagun?
Thank you. It's good enough, I think, Sagun. So maybe in next 4 or 5 minutes, we can wind up the session. So we can take up 1 or 2 more questions. Madhu, you want to say something?
Yes. Actually, first thing that we have been, this Nyaya view, especially from Sir, and we have learned from Sir a lot about the role of reason. So we see that in the matters such as this pursuing the spiritual or the ethically or even the pursuit of highest goal, it seems that not just generally in ordinary life, usually we see that the role of reason is very much undermined. So that definitely is there, and it shows. Now, second thing, also your comment on that, and the second question that I have exactly is that, because just you mentioned about Yoga Sutra itself, so that is from that perspective, or these two different schools, Nyaya and Yoga Sutra, Yoga. So in Nyaya, we see that pramana is one of the inference and perception. But certainly inference, as far as the true knowledge of self is concerned, is very important. But on the other hand, in yoga, we see yoga chitta vritti nirodha, and the chitta vrittis, they have pramana viparya vikalpa and nidra and smriti. So even pramana there is, it is not acceptable for them. So is there a contradiction? Of course, they would agree as far as the Vivek Khyati is concerned, the culmination of knowledge is concerned, true knowledge is concerned. Maybe the idea of true knowledge is concerned, or whether it is yam or niyama, they would agree, definitely. And certainly not to speak of Shankara, for whom even Jnana Karma Samuchaya, all that fails as far as the ultimate knowledge is concerned. So is there a contradiction? Because even pramana is also a sort of a problem. Now the perceiving, inferring is also a problem in knowing yourself, because that is taking away. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Madhu.
Yes, sir.
Now, the chitta vritti nirodha is necessary for Nyaya as well, as you must. There is absolutely no disagreement. Remember, in moksha, in the Nyaya view, of course, there is no bliss, right? There is no ananda. Is there any jnana? In the Nyaya view, no. As long as you have jnana, your point was that as long as we have pramana, we have this. That is also the Nyaya view. Absolutely the Nyaya view. Because at the state of moksha, this has to be discarded. It is dangerous. Consciousness has to be discarded as well. Pramana has to be discarded. So, of course, they do not have a theory of vritti exactly in the way yoga does and Sankhya, but that is because of some difference in their ontologies. But the key point is that, yes, you have to get to a stage where both for yoga and Nyaya, because all of those are linked with suffering for the Nyaya as well. As long as there is consciousness, there is suffering. Because consciousness does not take place for nothing. There are causal conditions. And the Nyaya view is, which is also the yoga view, that the causal conditions will invariably bring in suffering as well. So there is no conflict. I hope that helps.
Maybe.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you. We'll discuss it. It will. Yes.
Yes. So maybe last question from anyone. Neena madam, she is from Central University, Jammu.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening, ma'am. Please ask your question, please.
Good evening. Thank you so much, sir, for inviting me for this wonderful session. And my head is full of questions in both the sessions. Professor Chakrabarti, good evening. And I'm very, very grateful to you for, you're all philosophers and I teach literature. So in some places, whenever we are thinking about stories, we always tell our students, and we also look at it as, every story is trying to clarify some point of philosophy. So when you began the lecture by saying that when we talk about our body, we always talking about a body and identifying ourselves with a body, then I'm again and again, reminded of that dichotomy which we are experiencing. Our experiential life is with a body, but which is again materialism. And yet how we deal with the body life, with our material life, depends on that abstraction or the philosophical background on which we are basing our actions. So this dichotomy, I find that when we are doing philosophy, even sir, when he was talking about Professor Mishra, when he was talking about Rashtravad and all, these were ideas. These are abstract ideas, but when you have to apply them in daily life, as the student was also asking, there are practical difficulties. The body is always coming in the way, as you're saying, sir. It's cause of suffering. It's a cause of dukkha, and taking away desire. And so most of our desires and all are connected with the body itself. And the answer you've already given, it is to know yourself beyond the body. But sir, I'll just take the example of, for example, Dronacharya, a man who was a philosopher, a guru, everything, and he knew so much. And yet, when he saw his own son suffering, the bodily and the material suffering, he